For most of the world, counterterrorism is like a game of chess. Different countries make calculated moves to find terrorist threats wherever they emerge and eliminate them. But for many Middle Eastern countries, it seems like counterterrorism is more like a game of whack-a-mole, because every time they think they've eliminated one group, another one just seems to pop up. For many nations, the most recent terrorist group on the horizon has been Hezbollah, a radical Shia Muslim jihadist group that has sought to expand its influence throughout the Middle East. As Al Jazeera explains, on February 9th of this year, this has of course spawned a massive debate regarding its actions, with prominent figures coming out both for and against Hezbollah as a whole. One of these figures is Lokman Shlim, a prominent journalist and member of Lebanon's Shia Muslim community. He was an outspoken opponent of Hezbollah, and just a few days ago, paid the price. He was found dead in his car, shot multiple times. And shortly afterwards, Hezbollah leadership claimed responsibility for the attack. Therefore, it is imperative that we ask ourselves today's question. Does Lokman Shlim's murder foreshadow a new wave of violence against Hezbollah's critics? And upon closer inspection, the answer is clear, if sobering. It absolutely does. More specifically, because of an uptick in Hezbollah violence in three major nations. First, Israel, second, Lebanon, and third, Syria. But first, for many members of Hezbollah, Israel represents the ultimate task. They believe that it is their destiny to free Palestinians from what they perceive as Israeli oppression, to eliminate Israel from the region, and to recreate the area as a state solely for Palestinians. This has of course drawn it into conflict with the Israeli army, and while Israel did defeat the group and send them into the shadows for a time, with Lokman Shlim's murder, new Hezbollah actions seem to be fresh on the horizon. The Jerusalem Post explains on February 5th of this year that Hezbollah actions have been picking up throughout Israel. Hezbollah has numerous rockets and missiles stationed on the border between Israel and Palestine, as well as that between Israel and Lebanon. They've recently begun taking more actions with these rockets, firing on Israeli military targets, but occasionally missing and hitting areas like schools, hospitals, and residential areas. Because of Lokman Shlim's murder, Hezbollah feels emboldened. They feel that they can take a stance against one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East, and this has led to them perpetrating more dangerous acts of violence against Israel. Additionally, Reuters explains on February 9th of this year that Hezbollah operatives have begun to take more ground operations against the Israeli Defense Forces. They fought numerous battles with the Israeli military and have begun to counteract efforts from Israel to settle the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Essentially, thanks to the murder of Lokman Shlim, a whole nation of Hezbollah critics, that of Israel, is being faced down, and the results may be devastating. But of course, Israel isn't the only area where Hezbollah actions have proved destructive. Lebanon is yet another nation where Hezbollah has begun to be on the rise yet again. Lebanon and Hezbollah have a bit of a complicated relationship. Hezbollah has previously declared war against the government and fought against the Lebanese military in the country's civil war, where it was ultimately defeated. Yet despite this, Lebanon and Hezbollah, or rather Hezbollah, continues to have training camps in Lebanon and uses the southern regions of the country, the most Islamic and the least developed, as areas for it to stage attacks on neighboring nations. Unfortunately, with the murder of Lokman Shlim, Hezbollah feels that they can act throughout Lebanon with impunity. As Foreign Policy points out, on February 6th of this year, the increased sectarianism throughout Lebanon, primarily divided between French-speaking Christians and Arabic-speaking Muslims, has been an area for Hezbollah to draw upon. There are plenty of disenfranchised Islamic young men who feel that the country has left them behind. They feel that they've been essentially strung out to dry by the Christian French-speaking elite. Now, regardless of whether if this is true or not, Hezbollah has been playing upon these feelings and created a powerful source of new recruits for their organization. Because of the murder of Lokman Shlim, Hezbollah has only appeared more appealing. They're a group that, unlike many political parties, can actually get things done, or at least this is what their new recruits think. Unfortunately, as The Guardian further points out on February 10th of this year, the recent explosion in Lebanon's capital of Beirut has also left the country filled with economic instability. This, of course, plays directly into Hezbollah's hands and makes it easy for them to recruit more and more Lebanese as time goes on. But of course, Israel and Lebanon aren't the two places or the only places that are having to contend with a dangerous Hezbollah threat. War-torn Syria is yet another nation that, while traditionally outside of Hezbollah's operating range, is slowly becoming more and more close to this dangerous group. As the Jerusalem Post points out in a separate article on January 29th of this year, Hezbollah has recently begun to expand into Syria, citing the wartime devastation in the country as a perfect opportunity for their terrorist group to grow. Unfortunately, with the instability throughout Syria and the inability of the Assad government to respond to the threats, it's become more and more probable that Hezbollah will establish a large presence in Syria in the future. Lokman Shlim's murder can be in part credited for this. After all, as Hezbollah began to feel emboldened enough as to take out a prominent critic, they began to feel that they can move into other nations essentially at will. As Reuters further points out on January 26th of this year, this could have absolutely devastating consequences for Syria as a whole. Hezbollah has already been using Syria as a forward operating base to push into other nations. Most weapons given to Hezbollah from other nations are funneled through Syria, and the drug trade that in many parts is directly created by Hezbollah uses Syria as a staging area to funnel illicit substances to Europe and beyond. Essentially, Lokman Shlim's murder has emboldened Hezbollah significantly to the point where they feel they can act with impunity throughout the Middle East. So, when we look back on today's question, has Lokman Shlim's murder foreshadowed a new wave of violence against Hezbollah's critics? We can see that the answer is clear. It absolutely has. More specifically, thanks to an uptick in Hezbollah activity in three major nations: Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Thank you.